The rental car engine hummed softly as I pulled up to the Canada-US border crossing in upstate New York. Snow flurries danced in the beams of my headlights, and the faint glow of the Canadian flag flickered against the low winter sky. I rolled down the window, half expecting the usual grim interrogation I'd grown used to during domestic travel. Instead, the officer in the booth gave a nod, a polite good evening, and asked me genuinely how my trip was going. No edge, no suspicion, just calm curiosity. That was the first clue. Crossing into Canada didn't feel like entering a foreign country. It felt like slipping into a quieter, slightly slower version of my own life. But the longer I stayed, the more the differences stopped being subtle. They started getting weird in the best, most unexpected ways. My first stop was a gas station just outside Kingston, Ontario. I reached for the pump and saw that everything was in liters. Okay, fair enough. But then I walked inside and tried to buy a bottle of Advil, and the cashier told me I needed to go to a pharmacy. Not just over-the-counter meds. Pretty much anything medical here was guarded like it required a prescription. We don't sell Tylenol here, she said, as if I'd asked to buy fireworks. Later that day, I tried to make small talk with a woman in line at a Tim Hortons. Crazy weather, huh? I offered. She smiled, nodded once, and said nothing. The silence that followed stretched just a little too long. I shifted awkwardly. In the States, that would have triggered a whole weather rant and probably a story about someone's uncle's driveway flooding. Here, it was like I'd violated an invisible social rule. Don't force conversation unless you really mean it. And then came the milk bags. I'd walked into a suburban grocery store to pick up a few basics. Bread, eggs, milk. I reached the dairy aisle and just froze. Sitting where gallons should have been were soft, translucent plastic bags of milk. No caps, no jugs. Just bags. I stared at them for a solid 30 seconds, wondering if it was some kind of prank. A clerk passed by and said cheerfully, "You'll want a pitcher for those, hey?" I had no idea what he meant, and instead of explaining, he just kept walking. That night, I unpacked my groceries at my Airbnb and tried to call my credit card company using my US toll-free number. It didn't work. I Googled the number from my laptop. Still no luck. That's when I learned Canadian phones can't always dial American 1-800 numbers. A small thing, but it made me feel strangely cut off, like I'd left behind more than just a border. Even the way people said sorry here was different. It didn't mean guilt. It was like punctuation. Someone bumped into me at the market, and I instinctively apologized first. No, sorry," the woman said, placing her hand lightly on my arm. "I was in your way." She smiled and moved on. It wasn't performative. It was cultural, a reflex of collective politeness so deeply ingrained it almost felt surreal. As I lay in bed that night, watching snow fall softly outside the window, it hit me. I'd expected Canada to feel like home with colder weather and better manners. What I hadn't expected was to feel like I was slowly being retrained in how to be a person. This wasn't just a quieter America. It was its own universe of customs, rhythms, and rules, and I was just beginning to understand how far I had to go. I woke up to the soft crunch of snowplows outside, their rhythmic scraping as steady and reassuring as a lullaby. It was my first full morning in Canada, and I had no plans except to see how daily life here worked. But even that turned out to be a full-blown cultural education. My first mission was coffee. I stepped into a Tim Hortons expecting the usual caffeine jolt and go. But this wasn't a fast-paced, get-it-and-run American drive-thru. The line moved slowly, deliberately. People chatted, not loudly, just casually. A man in front of me turned and asked if I was visiting. I said yes, and he just nodded with a small welcome, like that was all that needed to be said. No need for theatrics. I ordered a black coffee and instinctively reached for the tip jar. There wasn't one. I asked if I could leave a tip anyway, and the cashier looked slightly confused. "Only if you really want to," she said, half shrugging. That was the first time I realized tipping wasn't built into the culture in the same way. No pressure, just do what feels right. Afterward, I drove to the local pharmacy to try again for headache medicine. The pharmacist asked me 3 different questions before handing it over. It wasn't hostile, just cautious. There was a strange sense of formality, even for something as basic as Advil. I couldn't decide if it was overkill or simply care dressed in bureaucracy. The small differences kept piling up. At the grocery store, a sign warned me to bring reusable bags or pay extra. A teenager at the entrance politely offered me a sanitized cart without a word. The produce section had more French than I was prepared for. Pommes for apples, laitue for lettuce. My brain kept translating in the background like I was in Montreal, not Ottawa. Even driving felt like another world. People actually let me merge. Not just once but every time I needed to. And they did it with a wave. A real, kind wave. One driver even stopped fully to let a pedestrian cross the street when no stop sign was even present. In the States, you'd get honked into oblivion for slowing traffic like that. Here, it was expected. Politeness wasn't a bonus. It was part of the operating system. Later that day, I visited a small bookstore. As I walked in, the owner gave a soft hello but didn't hover. No upselling, no tracking me through the aisles. Just space. At checkout, we chatted briefly about Margaret Atwood and snowy weekends. When I paid, he asked, "You new around here?" I nodded. "You'll find people take their time in Canada," he said. "No one's in a rush to prove anything." That phrase stuck with me. Back at my urban, I noticed a note left by the host on the counter. "Feel free to use the snow shovel by the door. Neighbors might pitch in too." And they did. That evening, as flakes thickened into drifts, two people from the next house came over without knocking and started shoveling the shared driveway. They didn't ask. They didn't make small talk. Just nodded at me as I joined in, and we worked quietly, side by side, until the path was clear. That night, exhausted and oddly moved, I realized something important. Life in Canada didn't just operate differently, it felt like it asked something different of you. Not just patience, but presence. Not performance, but participation. It wasn't trying to impress me. It was inviting me to slow down and contribute. And I didn't know it yet, but that would change the way I saw everything. It was late February when I noticed it. Not a single moment, but a slow, quiet shift that had been building for weeks. I was no longer instinctively checking over my shoulder on evening walks. I wasn't gripping my bag tighter in crowded spaces or rehearsing small talk to soften interactions. Something had lifted, and I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying it. Canada had done something to me. The turning point came during a Sunday afternoon skate on a frozen pond near my urban. I had borrowed skates from my host, bundled up like I was heading into a blizzard, and joined a crowd of strangers gliding across the ice. A young girl stumbled nearby and I instinctively reached to help. Her dad smiled and nodded at me. "Thanks, hey, no fuss, no suspicion. Just trust." I spent an hour out there, circling slowly, laughing with people I'd never met. Someone offered me a thermos of hot chocolate. A couple invited me to their cottage the next weekend if you're sticking around. And I realized no one was performing friendliness. It wasn't a show. It was just how people were here. Back home in the US, I was used to a kind of hyper-efficiency. Friendships took work. Time was currency. Kindness often came with strings. Here, there was a quiet generosity that didn't need permission or reward. And maybe that was the shock, the realization that decency could be normal. But it wasn't all utopia. I missed things too. I missed the buzz of American cities, the directness, the hustle. There were days when the calmness of Canada felt isolating. When I'd start a conversation only to get polite smiles and no follow-through. When I missed the way Americans dive into friendships fast and loud and messy. I also miss convenience stores open late, instant service, customer always right speed. Canada moved at its own pace. A gentler, more sustainable one, but it demanded patience. You couldn't brute force your way through it. You had to adapt. And I did. By the end of my stay, I found myself saying sorry without thinking, weaving cars through intersections, and instinctively reaching to help neighbors shovel snow. I stopped trying to fill every silence with words. I let people have their space. I learned to read warmth not in volume, but in small gestures, like someone leaving salt out on the steps for others to use. One evening, I returned to that same bookstore from my second day in town. The owner recognized me, smiled, and asked, "Still settling in?" I laughed and said, "I think I'm starting to get it." He handed me a worn paperback and said, "This one's on the house. Locals discount." As I walked home under falling snow, book in hand, I thought about how Canada hadn't asked me to change. It had simply shown me another way to be. One built not on performance, but quiet presence. Not on loud success, but on shared decency. When I finally packed to leave, my host left a note tucked under my door. "Glad you found your rhythm here. You're always welcome back." And I believed it. So if you're wondering what it's like to live in a place where kindness is habitual, where systems are built for trust, and where culture